When an avoidant finally has to sit inside the silence they created, that silence no longer feels calm. It starts to sound like everything they pushed away. There's usually a point in the story they never see coming, a moment that quietly cracks the emotional walls they've spent years building around themselves. It's not necessarily when you were crying in front of them. It's not when you begged for reassurance. And it's not even the exact moment you stopped contacting them. Their real discomfort often begins much later when they understand what their behavior actually cost them. They start to realize they pushed away someone who genuinely cared, someone who loved them without constantly demanding something back. And when they recognize that the person who once gave them so much emotional access has nothing left to offer, their silence becomes a reflection they can't easily dodge. Avoidant people can spend much of their lives believing emotional distance keeps them safe. They convince themselves that staying independent shields them from disappointment, rejection, vulnerability, and emotional pain. In their mind, needing someone can feel dangerous while keeping people at a manageable distance feels like freedom. They may link deep intimacy with losing control over their own life. Snorts. So when someone comes along offering genuine affection, consistency, and emotional depth, that closeness can trigger fears they don't fully understand. Instead of letting themselves receive the love, they may retreat from it. Instead of trusting the connection, they may hunt for reasons to doubt it. They build distance from the very person who may have been offering the emotional safety they secretly craved. And whenever you stayed after their withdrawal, forgave another cold response, or explained away their behavior, they could read your continued presence as proof they'd never truly lose you. That's why leaving doesn't always trigger an immediate emotional reaction in an avoidant. The first stage can actually feel surprisingly peaceful to them. When you walk away, they may initially feel relief rather than grief. The emotional pressure seems to lift. Their nervous system feels quieter, and they can convince themselves that creating distance was the right call. They may tell themselves the relationship had become too intense, that they needed their freedom, or that separation was necessary for their well-being. Somewhere in the background, they may still assume you'll eventually return. They've grown used to your effort being available. You were often the one keeping communication alive, repairing the distance, initiating conversations, and carrying much of the emotional momentum. Your consistency made their withdrawal feel safe because they believed they could step back without actually losing the relationship. As long as you stayed available, their distance carried no real consequence. But everything changes when that pattern stops. When you no longer send the message, make the call, explain yourself, or try to repair what they keep damaging. Something inside that familiar dynamic starts to shift. The silence they once created becomes the silence they have to live through. At first, they may not even register what's happening. They may assume you're simply giving them space, just as you have before. But as the days pass and your energy stays absent, their certainty starts to erode. The quiet that once felt comforting can gradually turn uncomfortable. They start noticing there's no longer someone standing on the other side of the distance waiting patiently for them. There's no familiar reassurance that you're still emotionally available. And that realization can completely transform how they perceive silence. What once felt like freedom can start feeling like loss, because the person who made their emotional distance feel safe is no longer playing along. Avoidant behavior often builds an illusion of control. Distance can make someone feel powerful because it gives them the impression they can dictate exactly how much closeness enters their life. They can step forward when intimacy feels manageable and retreat whenever vulnerability gets uncomfortable. But the crucial part is that this sense of control depends on the other person continuing to participate. Their ability to withdraw without consequences only works when someone else keeps reaching toward them. Their emotional safety may have been partly built on knowing you'd remain there no matter how many times they created distance. So when you finally stop engaging with the cycle, that sense of control starts to dissolve. They may slowly discover that what felt like power was actually dependent on your continued attention. The moment you stop supplying that attention, the dynamic shifts. Their distance can no longer guarantee your presence, and the emotional security they associated with being able to pull away starts to vanish. They may initially assume you're simply giving them the space they wanted. In their mind, this is temporary. They expect that eventually you'll return, calm down, soften, and once again be willing to forgive everything that happened. But as the days keep passing and you stay completely silent, something starts shifting beneath the surface. The distance that once made them feel protected starts making them feel alone. The quiet they once welcomed starts feeling strangely heavy. Slowly, they begin encountering emotions they once watched you struggle with. Questions start surfacing in their mind. Why haven't you reached out? Have you finally moved on? Did they push things too far? Alongside the confusion comes longing, uncertainty, and an emptiness they can't easily explain. And eventually, they begin recognizing something they never expected to experience. They're no longer controlling the emotional distance. The person they assumed would always remain available has finally stepped outside the pattern. Their emotional breaking point usually develops gradually rather than arriving in one dramatic moment. It can feel like invisible pressure building behind a wall that's been holding everything back for years. Small memories start finding their way into their thoughts. They remember the way you laughed, the sound of your voice, the little things you used to say, and the sense of calm your presence sometimes brought into their life. At first, they may dismiss these thoughts as simple memories. They might even enjoy remembering them without letting themselves feel anything deeper. But eventually, nostalgia can turn into something much harder to ignore. They start looking backward with different eyes. Conversations they once considered insignificant start carrying weight. Moments they previously brushed aside suddenly seem important. The more they remember, the harder it becomes to hold on to the belief that losing you was simply the fair price for staying independent. They may start recognizing how much effort you actually poured into keeping the connection alive. They remember how many times you tried to communicate instead of walking away. They remember the patience you showed when they were distant, the understanding you offered when they couldn't explain themselves, and the chances you gave them even after they disappointed you. What once felt like pressure can eventually look very different from a distance. They may realize your love wasn't necessarily demanding they become someone else. It was simply consistent. You were there. You cared. You kept showing up even when their behavior made it hard. And this realization can change the entire meaning of the relationship in their mind. The closeness they once read as overwhelming may start to look like something stable and rare. The affection they once wanted to escape may become the very thing they wish they could feel again. That's when the emotional weight of the distance can become much harder to carry. The space they once believed would make everything easier has now become the place where they repeatedly run into your absence. The silence that once seemed necessary starts reminding them that you're no longer there to fill it. They may start wondering whether they misread what they had. They may question whether they walked away from someone they should have fought for. But this realization doesn't necessarily mean they immediately know how to fix what happened. Avoidant patterns are often built around fear rather than a lack of emotion. There can be genuine feelings underneath the withdrawal, but those feelings may have been buried because vulnerability felt threatening. Pride can become a protective disguise for fear, and eventually that protection can become extremely costly. When someone loses a person who genuinely loved them, the emotional fallout may not show up right away. Their mind can delay the grief because shutting down feels safer than facing it. For a while, emotional numbness can help them hold on to the story that everything is fine. They can stay busy, distract themselves, focus on independence, or convince themselves they made the logical choice. But emotional suppression doesn't erase what happened. Eventually, the defenses start weakening, and everything they pushed away can come back with greater force. They start confronting the consequences they dodged. They recognize that while they were trying to protect themselves from dependence, rejection, or vulnerability, they were also damaging the very connection that could have given them genuine emotional security. They start seeing that their attempts to avoid pain created another kind of pain entirely, and eventually the deepest realization lands. The loss is no longer simply about missing another person. It becomes about confronting who they were inside that relationship, who they could have been had they let themselves love openly, and what part of themselves vanished when they pushed away someone who made them feel deeply understood. For a long time, they may believe they're the ones deciding how close the relationship gets. When intimacy starts feeling uncomfortable, they pull back. When emotions get too intense, they go quiet. When you ask for clarity, they create more distance. And when the pressure disappears, they may return as though nothing significant happened. Because you were often the one who responded to that pattern, they slowly grew accustomed to believing the connection would always stay available to them. They could disappear and come back. They could create distance and still find you waiting. They could shield themselves from vulnerability without having to fully face the consequences of losing someone. That pattern can build a very powerful sense of security because everything seems predictable. They know what happens when they withdraw. They expect you to eventually reach out, soften, forgive, or try again. As long as you keep doing those things, they never have to question whether their distance could actually cost them the relationship. But then something changes. You stop responding in the way they have come to expect. You do not become angry and chase them. You do not send another emotional explanation hoping they will finally understand. You do not keep proving that your feelings are still there. You simply become quiet and begin turning your attention back toward your own life. And that change can be far more powerful than any argument could have been. Suddenly the pattern they understood no longer works the same way. They cannot predict when you will contact them because you are no longer contacting them. They cannot assume that another conversation is waiting because you are no longer creating one. They cannot depend on your patience to keep repairing the same emotional distance. For the first time, their withdrawal has an outcome they cannot manage. The space they created is still there, but now they are the ones standing inside it. That is when the emotional experience can begin to change. Before, distance may have felt like something they controlled. It gave them room to breathe, time to think, and the ability to avoid conversations they were not ready to have. But once you stop filling that distance, it becomes something different. It becomes a reminder that another person has their own limits. They begin realizing that you were never permanently attached to the role of waiting for them. You were choosing to stay. You were choosing to forgive. You were choosing to keep trying. And choices can change. That realization can be deeply unsettling because it removes the certainty they had built around your presence. They may have thought your love was simply there, something they could step away from and return to whenever they felt comfortable. Now they are confronted with the possibility that your love was never an unlimited resource. It was something you gave willingly, and eventually you reached a point where giving more meant abandoning yourself. This is where the silence begins carrying a completely different emotional weight. Before silence belonged to them, they used it when they needed distance. They could disappear into it and tell themselves they were simply protecting their peace. But now the same silence exists without their permission. They cannot decide when it ends because ending it requires another person to participate. They may wonder whether you are angry, whether you have moved on, whether someone else has entered your life, or whether you simply stopped caring. They may never ask these questions aloud, but internally, uncertainty can become louder. The mind often struggles when a familiar pattern suddenly stops producing the expected result. If they were used to you reaching out after every period of distance, your continued silence becomes information. It tells them that something has changed, and sometimes what hurts most is not knowing exactly what changed, but realizing that they no longer have access to the answer. They may also begin remembering how often you made the relationship emotionally safe for them without realizing it. You were the one who kept conversations going when they became uncomfortable. You were the one who gave them opportunities to explain themselves. You were the one who accepted their need for space while still remaining emotionally present. Because those things happen repeatedly, they may have stopped noticing them. Familiarity can make effort invisible. When someone consistently provides patience, understanding, reassurance, and emotional availability, those qualities can eventually feel like part of the environment rather than something being actively given. You only understand how much something was supporting you when it disappears. So when you stop providing that emotional stability, they may begin noticing all the things they once took for granted. The absence does not create those memories. It simply makes them impossible to overlook. And this can be where regret begins to develop. Not necessarily because they suddenly decide everything about the relationship was perfect, but because they start seeing their own behavior from a different position. While they were inside the relationship, they may have focused on what closeness demanded from them. After separation, they may begin noticing what your presence gave them. They remember the moments when you were patient instead of reactive. They remember how you tried to understand what they could not explain. They remember the ordinary moments that once seemed insignificant because they were always available. A simple conversation, a familiar message, a shared joke, the comfort of knowing someone cared. These things can become emotionally significant once they are no longer guaranteed. What once felt ordinary can suddenly feel rare. The difficult part is that this realization may come after the other person has already emotionally changed. While they were taking distance, you may have been learning how to live without depending on their attention. You may have started accepting that you could not force someone to become emotionally available. You may have stopped interpreting every withdrawal as something you needed to fix. You may have begun rebuilding your peace around your own life rather than around their behavior, and that creates a painful contrast. They may only be beginning to understand the value of the connection at the exact moment you are beginning to understand that you cannot keep sacrificing yourself to maintain it. They are looking backward while you are learning to look forward. They are feeling the weight of your absence while you are discovering what your own presence feels like again. That is why your silence should not be understood as a strategy designed to make someone miss you. The deeper shift happens when the silence is no longer about getting a reaction from them. You are not sitting beside the phone wondering whether they will finally realize your worth. You are not counting the days and waiting for a message that proves they care. You are simply no longer willing to participate in a cycle that repeatedly leaves you emotionally exhausted. That difference matters. When silence is used as manipulation, you are still emotionally tied to the other person's response. But when silence comes from acceptance, you are no longer organizing your life around whether they return. You are allowing their choices to belong to them while allowing your own choices to belong to you. And that is often what changes the entire emotional balance. They can no longer assume that your love means unlimited access. They can no longer rely on the idea that you will always be there regardless of how distant they become. They may finally understand that someone can love them deeply and still decide to leave. Someone can care about them and still refuse to keep chasing. Someone can forgive them and still choose not to repeat the same cycle. That realization can be difficult because it separates love from self-abandonment. Your willingness to stay was never proof that they could treat the connection however they wanted. Your patience was not a promise that you would tolerate everything forever. And your silence is not punishment. It is simply what happens when one person stops carrying a relationship that requires two people to sustain it. Eventually, they may begin facing the question they avoided for so long. What if the distance that protected me from vulnerability also protected me from receiving the love I actually wanted? What if the person I kept pushing away was not the source of the emotional danger I feared? What if the constant need to escape closeness was costing me the very connection I was secretly hoping would remain? These questions can be uncomfortable because there is no easy way to answer them without looking honestly at their own behavior. They may have to acknowledge that some of the loneliness they're experiencing did not simply happen to them. Some of it was created through repeated choices, every unanswered message, every unnecessary withdrawal, every emotional wall, every moment when they chose distance instead of communication contributed to the final outcome. And perhaps the hardest realization is that you were never responsible for breaking through those walls. You could knock on them. You could communicate. You could offer patience. You could show them that closeness did not have to mean losing themselves, but you could not make the decision for them. Eventually, they had to decide whether they wanted to keep protecting themselves from emotional risk or learn how to tolerate the vulnerability required for genuine connection. When you finally stop standing outside the wall, waiting for it to come down, they are left alone with the wall itself. And that is when they may begin to understand what it actually protected them from. It did not only protect them from rejection, disappointment, or emotional pain, it also protected them from intimacy, from being deeply known, from being loved without having to perform, and from experiencing the kind of connection they once believed they could control simply by keeping enough distance. And once that realization begins settling in, they may start noticing something even more uncomfortable. The relationship did not simply disappear because you stopped reaching out. It changed because the pattern between you finally stopped receiving the energy that kept it alive. For a long time, they may have believed that they could remain emotionally distant while still keeping some invisible connection to you. They could tell themselves that you were still there somewhere, that the door was not completely closed, and that if they ever wanted to return, they would find you waiting. But now that assumption is no longer guaranteed. Your life continues without their involvement. You begin creating routines that do not include them. You become less interested in explaining yourself to someone who repeatedly misunderstood your needs. And slowly they may recognize that while they were focused on maintaining their emotional independence, you were learning how to become emotionally independent from them. This is where the difference between missing someone and truly recognizing their value can become important. Missing you may happen because your presence was familiar, comforting, or emotionally significant. But recognizing your value requires them to look beyond the feeling of absence and understand what they actually lost. They may remember how easily you noticed when something was wrong. They may remember the way you could make ordinary moments feel meaningful. They may remember how you stayed present during moments when they were difficult to reach. These memories can become especially powerful because they are connected to emotional safety rather than excitement alone. They may realize that what they once considered ordinary was actually a form of consistency they had rarely allowed themselves to fully appreciate. And when that consistency disappears, they may discover that not every person they meet will offer the same patience, understanding, or emotional depth. At some point, they may also begin comparing the present with the past. New conversations do not feel exactly the same. New people may not understand them in the same way. Attention from someone else may provide temporary distraction, but distraction is not the same as emotional connection. This is where the difference between replacing a person and replacing a feeling becomes obvious. You may still care about them, but caring no longer means waiting. That is a major internal shift. The goal is not to become cold or pretend you never loved them. The goal is to reach a place where their emotional availability no longer determines your emotional stability. You can remember what happened without constantly reopening the wound. You can acknowledge the good without denying the painful parts. And you can accept that someone may have loved you in whatever capacity they were capable of, while still recognizing that what they offered was not enough for the relationship you needed. This is where the silence becomes something much deeper than simply not communicating. It becomes the space in which both people are forced to experience the consequences of their choices separately. They have to live with their decision to create distance while you have to live with your decision to stop pursuing someone who could not consistently meet you. Neither experience is exactly the same. They may eventually feel the emptiness of your absence, while you may gradually feel the peace that comes from no longer fighting for emotional certainty. And that difference can become significant. What initially looked like them having control and you losing control can eventually reverse itself. They may have believed that walking away gave them freedom while you felt abandoned. But with time, you may discover that leaving the cycle gave you something they were still searching for: the ability to live without constantly monitoring another person's emotional availability. Eventually, the most powerful change may not happen inside them at all. It happens inside you. You stop needing to know exactly when they will miss you, whether they regret leaving or what they are thinking during the silence. Those questions lose some of their power because your attention has returned to your own life. You begin asking different questions. What do I want now? What kind of relationship feels safe for me? What behavior am I willing to accept? What does consistency look like? What does love feel like when I'm not constantly trying to earn it? These questions move you away from analyzing their psychology and back toward understanding yourself. And that is where healing becomes real. Because the ultimate purpose of walking away is not to create a reaction in someone who could not meet you. It is to stop abandoning yourself while waiting for someone else to finally choose.